Hello, A-Pushers. This is Mr. Laubach. I hope you're having a great day. In this video, I'm going to introduce the Roaring Twenties and talk about some of the key items and events of the time period. We will go over the economic prosperity of the 1920s, the Jazz Age, the Harlem Renaissance, the Flappers, discrimination and racism in the 1920s, the Red Scare, the Prohibition and organized crime, and mass media and entertainment during the 1920s. Let's start by giving some context to the Roaring Twenties. The decade is referred to the Roaring Twenties due to the supposedly new and less inhibited lifestyles that many people embraced during this time period. Remember, during the Progressive Era, the government was tightening regulations on businesses. After World War I, economic regulation would become much looser, back to laissez-faire or free market economics. The Roaring Twenties is also known as the undoing of the Progressive Era. So many of the progressive policies regarding the economy were reversed. Following the end of World War I, the American economy experienced some difficulties transitioning back from a wartime to a peacetime footing. There was a major downturn between 1920 and 1921, and then the economy took off at an unprecedented level. America's economic boom in the 1920s led to mass production of goods, the electrification of America, new mass marketing techniques, the availability of cheap credit, and increased employment, which in turn created a huge amount of consumers. The Roaring Twenties are often also referred to as the Golden Twenties, the Jazz Age, the Flapper Era, and the Mad Decade. The 1920s was the most prosperous decade in American history. Of course, not everyone shared in this prosperity. Many farmers did not do as well as urban dwellers. The wealthy benefited more than the working class from the robust prosperity that was occurring. Nevertheless, a remarkably broad group of Americans saw their living conditions improve. Good times reduced industrial strife and the number of strikes declined. Though businessmen still generally opposed unions, many were increasingly open to labor organizations' views and provided their workers with better pay and benefits. In the post-World War I years, many Americans were ready to reject traditional attitudes towards personal expression and sexuality. They believed the manners and morals of previous generations had been discredited by the war and had become out of date in a faster-paced modern American society. Let's take a close look at the term the Jazz Age. The Jazz Age was a cultural period and movement that took place in America during the 1920s, from which both new styles of music and dance emerged and relaxed attitudes began to increase. Largely credited to African Americans employing new musical techniques along with traditional African techniques, jazz soon expanded to America's white middle class as well. The popularity of jazz music opened up opportunities for African American musicians. Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington saw success and became mainstream household names during the 1920s. Jazz music certainly had its critics. Many referred to it as the devil's music. This was very similar to what traditionalists later said about rock and roll and rap music. The Harlem Renaissance was the 1920s black literary and cultural movement that produced many works depicting the role of blacks in contemporary American society. Novelist Zora Neale Hurston and poet Langston Hughes were key members of this movement. While this movement was centered in Harlem, New York City, it was not limited to that area. It was taking place in many urban areas around the country. The flapper image, aka the new woman of the 1920s. Flappers of the 1920s were young women known for their energetic freedom and embraced a lifestyle viewed by many at the time as outrageous, immoral, and downright dangerous. Flappers were considered the first generation of independent American women. They pushed barriers in economic, political, and sexual freedom. Many historians believe the flapper was the most dominant image of the 1920s. The amount of racism and discrimination against African Americans also grew during the 1920s, in both the North and the South. Many African Americans fought valiantly in World War I and expected their lives to improve when they returned home. Unfortunately, this was not the case. Leading up to the 1920s, there were significant race riots in East St. Louis in 1917 and in Chicago in 1919. Also, the Great Migration was happening, where many blacks in the South were moving to the North to get away from discrimination and racism in the South and to look for jobs in northern cities. Unfortunately, they, as mentioned earlier, were met with racism in the North also. And by 1924, the KKK reached its highest membership in history with over 5 million members. The first Red Scare in the earlier part of the 1920s. After World War I, the fear of communism and a communist revolution in the United States spread like wildfire. This became known as the Red Scare era. This fear was inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. People in the United States became paranoid of communism. Immigrants and unions were often accused of being communist sympathizers. The Red Scare resulted in discrimination, hate crimes, and suspension of civil liberties and deportation of hundreds of immigrants. The vast majority had committed no crime. Nativist fears also resulted in restrictive quota legislation being passed in the 1920s. The Palmer raids are synonymous with the Red Scare. A bomb went off in the house of Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, and destroyed his front porch. Palmer responded by launching a roundup of suspected radicals. As part of the Red Scare, thousands of Americans not born in the United States were arrested and hundreds were sent back to their countries of origins. This became known as the Palmer Raids. Palmer used the hysteria and fear of communism to grow his own political career. The Prohibition in the United States was a nationwide constitutional ban on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages from 1920 to 1933. The Prohibition was more successful in rural areas than urban areas. In the state of Kansas, it is estimated that 95% of the residents followed the Prohibition stipulations as opposed to only 5% in New York State. In short, overall, the Prohibition did not work out very well in the United States, and many historians see it as a big American mistake. Organized crime of the 1920s. The Prohibition opened the door for organized crime involving the smuggling or bootlegging of alcohol into the United States. Speakeasies also appeared. These were illegal bars, and bribery of law officials became very commonplace. Bootlegging was a big and profitable business. Bootleggers like Al Capone in Chicago became very notorious. This is a pretty famous painting of Al Capone over here on the right. Capone controlled hundreds of gunmen and got into bloody, very well-publicized wars with other bootlegger gangs. The Prohibition finally ended with the ratification of the 21st Amendment in 1933. It is the only time in U.S. history that one amendment has repealed another amendment. Mass media and entertainment of the 1920s. Mass media came of age in the 1920s. Advertising, newspapers, radio, motion pictures provided new forms of entertainment in the 20s and helped create a uniform national culture. Americans in both the city and countryside were exposed to a glittering roster of heroes. Some of the more notable superstars of the 1920s were home run king Babe Ruth, pictured over on the right, college football star Red Grange of Notre Dame, boxing champion Jack Dempsey. Movie stars of the decade included Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Clara Bow, and Rudolph Valentino. However, the most dramatic media event of the decade was the national reaction to Charles Lindbergh's 1927 solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean in his famous airplane named the Spirit of St. Louis. The undeniably brave, handsome, and modest aviator was viewed as the quintessential American hero. He was the modern exemplar of the pioneer spirit of America.